collaboration thing, which again has been talked about here. Doing for rather than with, doing long-term when long-term isn't needed anymore, playing the professional rather than sharing expertise and leaving when the expertise is there. That's related to the second one, short-term studies, interventions, pilots, and again, I'm not trying to say they don't have value, but they don't make long-term systems change. So when the funding dries up or the interest dries up or whatever happens, and that those pilots disappear, nothing's really changed over the long term. This focus on whiz-bang, again, that's been talked about rather than locally sustainable. You all know better than I do that R&D isn't necessarily perfect everywhere. Then finally, this is a real concern of mine because it's true in this country and I think probably everywhere. Disability rights advocates, for the most part, have had support in the area of physical impairment, not cognitive impairment. And so there's still a divide within the disability community between access to community for those with physical versus cognitive. And I think when we focus on assistive technology and adaptive equipment, it's really clearly also the case where, and I'm not, again, trying to point fingers and blame anywhere, but we've been able to think about that in terms of physical accommodations much more successfully than we have with cognitive kinds of supports. So it's a challenge to all the scientific researchers in the group here of how to do that, because we're ending up in some parts of the world with a very marginalized group. And the convention recognizes that. There's really an acknowledgement that everybody is included in this. It is not just those that we know really what to do to help and to provide access to the community. It's everybody. I gave you two websites which you may be familiar with, but if you don't know and you want, sort of the emerging guidelines that are coming out from the UN, and there's a lot coming out recently. The states parties guidelines for reporting just came out a couple months ago. The UN is expecting the first states parties reports to be coming in sometime this year. So that's up there. WHO has some interesting stuff on rehab and disability, which you might be interested. But the UN Enable website is the portal really for the UN system for everything related to this convention. So it's the one sort of stop place you can go if you want to look internationally what the UN is saying, which doesn't cover the vast majority of work out there, I know that, but at least it'll give you some clear writing now, soft law about the implementation. Thank you. 5 minutes of questions. Questions? Very
Jyoti, so I'm really happy that you're a legal scholar because this is a good question for you. I've looked at the convention in reasonable detail, and I was wondering every time I read it, is that whether the specificity of the number of times specific things are mentioned, as well as things such as the optional protocol and what it requires various states to do, whether that is a good thing or whether that dilutes the convention and the idea of international conventions in general, which means that there is a state thinking through well enough before it decides to sign on to something. And related to that, I was also struck by the amount of interest in technology and the number of times the technology is referred to R&D, provision of low-cost technology, at early stage provision of low-cost, as opposed to training of manpower, which is not as prominent in the convention, whether you could address it.
Let me take the first one because I'm not a technology person. I think, so here's my take on it. And I didn't look at all, I follow very closely those ad hoc committees trying to develop this convention because I thought it was going to be a fascinating political process. But how they were going to do this, just even defining disability was incredibly complicated.
And they don't.
And they don't, because that was politically the only way they could get it out the door, right? Which I think actually is a great thing. But I think it was effort to be comprehensive. And when you look at the Americans with Disabilities Act, there is nothing in there that supports in any different way access to information technology. It was written, we know, in 1990 and based on earlier law, mid-70s, but we didn't think about that stuff. So there is no, so now we're left with these guidelines, reasonable accommodation, access to information, but not access to IT per se, in our own law. So my bet is that people designing this convention didn't want to leave out anything that might be really important to people in the future. And sort of doing that long picture analysis decided we have to include this. We have to really focus on this because the world is going that way, for good or bad. I don't think it's at the expense of social participation, inclusion in society, importance of humanity or getting out of the house. I don't think it's at the expense of that intentional. I don't think it's intended to negate the other. Whether it'll end up doing that or not, I don't know. On the other side of it, developing countries, don't have, right? Those that don't have the income, the budget in their national government to help develop technology. This is a way, I think, they might be able to tap into some funding under the convention. Is that making sense? I think things put into the convention are designed intentionally to get funding. And I think there's an intention to make this broad and encompass the future, and we don't know what the future is. That's all I know about that. America was involved in the drafting of this convention, even though we, at the federal level, were not supportive of it. There were lots of NGOs in there. Now, what was your other, I'm sorry, you had another.
Well, I was just interested in whether it, from if you compare it to China, Christ of China, is it better to have a convention which has more such that you can pinpoint what are the various things that you did or did not do versus something which is less, but is
less didn't
relatively
work. Less didn't work. I mean, I think that's what standard rules showed us. Less didn't work. CRC, very clearly written in the law, disability for kids, children with disabilities, very specific. It is included in states' parties, but it is not a highlight. I think focusing or having a convention stand alone with very specific things is going to force states' parties. I think it does send a message, though, that worries me. They're different. They're just different, and that worries me big time. But I think it's a way to raise awareness and to make states' parties be very specific on it. Can it get in the way of really making change? Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. It's a nice overview. I'm interested in your thoughts on the definition of disability and the World Health Organization. And as I was reminded once by the chair of psychiatry here, and I think I confirmed looking at some WHO materials that the most common cause of disability around the world is psychiatric disease. And we think of mental or physical disability, cognitive disability, and then if you look at a broad definition, there's psychiatric or some other whole group out there that doesn't fall into those other ones.
And what's fascinating about that is that you just said psychiatric disease.
Right.
You've already made your you're already distinguishing
Yeah.
all these other disabilities, but disease.
Yeah.
No, I know.
Yeah.
And when I say cognitive, I'm including, we think of developmental disabilities or maybe intellectual disabilities and psychiatric. I put them all in to one category, which is not a good thing to do because no one knows what I'm talking about half the time, right? I mean,
Yeah.
they're very, very, but those two groups for me, those two groups are the ones that legally we have not addressed. We just haven't. We lump them into disability. If you want to go to court under the ADA and you have a psychiatric diagnosis, I'll use that word, then you can argue that you have a disability under the ADA, and you can argue disability discrimination, right? But the laws do not talk about capacity to make decisions, surrogate decision, or civil rights laws.